Imagine finding yourself in a small metal box, surrounded by hundreds of kilograms of ammunition and fuel, on the battlefield where you're the primary target, and all it takes is one spark in the wrong place for flames to engulf you in seconds. This was constantly on the minds of thousands of tank crews, as they spent numerous hours in merciless conditions where everything from outside and inside the tank tried to harm them. Tankers had a saying: tanks are designed to hurt people, and they don't care which one. And in this video, we will describe to you the dark realities behind the tanks and their crews, and what horrors people have endured serving in them. After their first appearance in the First World War, and especially during World War II, when tanks saw mass use in extreme conditions from the scorching deserts to the harsh Russian winters, tanks have always been a fascinating sight. However, when you scratch beneath the surface of the fearless, armored machine that destroys everything in its path, you realize that there is a much darker side to this weapon. They were exceptional infantry support both in offense and defense, with tremendous firepower and destructive abilities to demolish everything in their way and with armor to repel every attack. Yet, on the other hand, they also had terrifying flaws, weaknesses, and dangers to their crew. From the moment tanks first appeared on the battlefield in the First World War, they were nearly as horrible for their crew as they were for the enemy. Engines not separated from the crew compartment created exhaust fumes and additional heat, and the noise was so deafening that communication inside the tank was almost impossible. However, despite all their drawbacks, the first tanks had some impact on the battlefield in breaking through enemy trench lines. Yet, the Second World War would see the first mass use and development of tanks, as well as the largest tank battles in history, and what the crews of these deadly machines would endure would be, to say the least, terrifying. Let's start with the first and greatest fear of all tankers: fire. Fire is extremely undesirable in tight spaces when you are surrounded by ammunition and fuel. And just the thought that if your tank is hit, in just a few seconds, everything could be enveloped in flames instilled terror into the crew's subconscious. When a tank was hit, in most cases, at least some crew members would be fatally injured. And that was terrifying because then, with their bodies, they would block the path for any possible survivors. An American World War II veteran described how their tank was hit by an anti-tank gun, and the projectile immediately killed the gunner and tank commander. Since he was the loader, he couldn't exit because of his comrades' bodies, but as the flames grew, he crawled under the gun and through the driver's seat and its hatch, managing to escape just in time before the tank exploded. Another horrific example comes from a British World War II veteran who remembered for the rest of his life a situation from the African front when the tank next to theirs was hit and immediately caught fire. At that moment, one of the crew was on the radio on a channel that all other tanks could hear, and from the tank engulfed in flames, they could hear his voice saying, "Help me, help me." Horrified, the friendly tank, knowing they could not help in any way, decided to fire 2 more shells from their gun into the burning tank to at least end their comrades' agony. After the second hit, the voice was no longer heard. I don't know about you, but I got chills after hearing this story in a documentary. As tanks advanced and developed, so did the methods and techniques to disable and destroy them. One of the first counter-tank measures were anti-tank rifles, with stronger and larger caliber ammunition designed to penetrate armor and kill the crew inside. A bullet that pierced the armor could ricochet inside the tank, creating a total massacre or activating ammunition or fuel. Soon after, armor was thickened and strengthened to protect against this threat, and then anti-tank guns were introduced. Besides them, there were various methods of destroying tanks by infantry, such as magnetic mines, Molotov cocktails, and shaped charges. An interesting fact about Molotov cocktails is that they were initially very effective in destroying tanks because, during the rapid mass production, not much care was taken to ensure that the armor plates were assembled well enough to not let anything through. So in those cracks between panels or between the turret and the tank body, the flammable, sticky mixture of the cocktail found its way inside the tank and dripped onto the crew and ammunition. And thus, a simple weapon, like an ordinary glass bottle with a bit of a flammable mixture, destroyed the tank. For these weapons to be effective, enemy soldiers had to approach terrifyingly close to the tanks, so tanks without infantry support were often very vulnerable targets. Due to better protection, visibility was significantly reduced. The crew relied on the commander, who most of the time had his head out of his hatch and watched carefully. And besides that, The only source of visibility were narrow periscopes which could often fog up or get dirty from the outside, further reducing visibility. Thus, enemies could exploit these blind spots and get close enough to deliver a deadly blow, or even climb on the tank and throw a bomb inside, making a tragic end for the crew. Even hits that did not penetrate the armor could have a terrible effect inside, as the force of the projectile's impact could cause metal from the inside to detach and fly at high speed towards the crew's face, sometimes causing deadly wounds. An additional horror in World War II for most American Sherman tanks was the gasoline engine. Even aircraft engines running on kerosene were used. Since gasoline and kerosene are significantly more flammable than diesel, these tanks received morbid nicknames from the enemy, especially from the Germans who called them after famous lighters, whose advertisement was that they always light on the first try. Another morbid nickname was for the American tank M3 Lee, terribly called Six Brothers Grave, because it had a 6-member crew, and due to its size was a large target, and often overmatched by more modern German tanks it encountered. Unlike the Allies in World War II, the Germans had variations of anti-tank shells that were designed to ignite inside the tank after penetrating the armor, thus significantly increasing their lethality. Besides direct hits from anti-tank guns and rifles, and various infantry methods for their destruction at close range, rocket systems for infantry such as bazookas, Panzerfausts, or today's known RPGs were developed. These innovations gave a single soldier the ability to destroy a war machine like a tank from a good position, or ambush with relatively simple weaponry. This added to the horror for the crew, who had to be even more vigilant and prepared for everything imaginable, and even traps like mines, anti-tank ditches, and barriers. Regular emergency exit drills were held, and procedures for exiting the tank in panic were routinely rehearsed by the crew to increase their chances in case they were hit. Of course, this was significantly harder in reality when some of the crew members were wounded, killed, or stuck, and flames approached while panic rose. On top of this, enemy infantry lurked, further targeting the tank crew attempting to leave the tank. So it often happened that immediately after they left the safety of the tank, they were met with gunfire. And when they left the tank, now absolutely unprotected and lightly armed in the heat of battle, they had to find their way to friendly lines and safety. When we exclude the direct dangers from enemy fire and weapons, the tank itself is a great danger to its crew. Even if we disregard the proximity of weapons, ammunition, and fuel in a small enclosed space filled with people, handling this machine and staying safe is a challenge enough. Moving parts, such as the turret and cannon, powered by powerful hydraulic pumps, could crush parts of the crew's bodies if they got in the way during movement. During turret rotations, early tanks did not have a basket that rotated the crew along with it, so injuries were common when various body parts found themselves in the path of moving parts of the tank. An example from even a modern Leopard tank is when a loader stretched out his leg, and just at that moment, the tank commander turned the turret, thus breaking his femur. Also, various hydraulic pumps were prone to overheating and sometimes exploded, spilling hot oil over the crew. Failures of cannons and ammunition could also cause internal explosions, resulting in the total destruction of the tank and its crew. Vapors, engine gases, pumps, and fired ammunition also remained within the tank, further impairing visibility, breathing, and creating a toxic atmosphere for the crew. For example, American World War II tank Sherman Firefly gunners were known for having burned eyebrows and eyelashes, because every time the cannon fired, sparks and gases from fired round would directly fly into the gunner's face, so they were instructed to close their eyes at the moment of firing. If all this wasn't enough, there are also the weather conditions in which tanks were used, from deserts to the icy winters of Russia. Tank crews in Africa literally fried eggs on the hull of their tanks, and staying in them was a hell unto itself, as there was no way to regulate temperature at the time, and even today it is rare and difficult for tankers to have air conditioning even in modern tanks. During the brutal winters, the metal walls of the tank were so cold that the skin would stick to them, and the way of heating was through petrol lamps, which would at least slightly alleviate the agony. The crew spent an incredibly long time inside tanks, during battles even longer, unable to leave them. Thus, they would perform all their human needs from sleeping, eating, to toilet, in the cramped spaces of the tank. The toilet was often a bucket or an empty ammunition box, and soldiers rarely had time and ways to bathe and maintain personal hygiene, so the inside of the tank was often filled with horrible smells. Additional risk was exposed to commanders who spent most of their time standing in the tank, with their head outside to observe the battlefield. Because, as they say, it's much more dangerous what you can't see than putting your head out. Their task was incredibly mentally demanding, as they were responsible for the entire tank and crew, in constant communication with both the crew and other tanks, other battlefield participants, and command. It's interesting that today, although tanks have significantly evolved and their protection and protective systems against various threats have evolved alongside, weapons designed to destroy them have evolved as well, so being a tanker is just as dangerous even today. With various modern systems, rockets, mines, drones, and ammunition designed to penetrate any existing armor, it's hard to protect oneself on the battlefield. However, tanks also pose a great threat to their enemies, with their significantly increased range, precision, target detection systems, cannon stabilization systems, and the ability to fire while the tank is moving, greater firepower, and more destructive ammunition. In short, it's fascinating how much human technology will advance in the aim of destroying each other and also in protecting from the same threats. What's your opinion on this fascinating piece of military hardware, and do you think tanks will eventually become redundant on the modern battlefield? Also, I wonder if any of you would be brave enough to endure all the dark sides of tanking, as many people did during the world's greatest conflicts.